On the night of January 2nd, 1777, Lord Cornwallis stood on the south bank of a shallow creek in Trenton, New Jersey, and he was certain of one thing. Tomorrow morning, the American Revolution would be over. He had 8,000 soldiers behind him, veterans of European campaigns, professional infantrymen, Hessian mercenaries in blue coats with years of battlefield experience. Across the creek, trapped against the Delaware River with nowhere left to go, was George Washington's army, exhausted men, many of them barely clothed, an army that had been retreating for 6 months, an army that, by every calculation that mattered, should have already collapsed. Cornwallis had Washington cornered in a way that no British general had managed since the war began. His officers urged him to press the attack that night, force the creek crossing in the dark, and finish it. Cornwallis reportedly told them the fox was caught. They would bag him in the morning. What nobody knew, not Cornwallis, not his officers, not the shivering sentries watching the American campfires flicker across the water, was that the weather was about to do something that should have been impossible. Something that would turn a certain British victory into one of the most humiliating strategic collapses of the entire Revolutionary War. By sunrise on January 3rd, 1777, George Washington's army had vanished, and in the small college town of Princeton, 10 miles away, a British garrison was about to learn why you should never assume the fox is caught. To understand what happened at Princeton, you have to understand how desperate everything had become in the weeks before it. Through the summer and fall of 1776, the British war machine had been nearly unstoppable. General William Howe landed more than 30,000 soldiers in New York, one of the largest expeditionary forces Britain had ever assembled. They pushed Washington off Long Island. They took Manhattan. They drove the Continental Army south across New Jersey in a retreat so disorganized it barely deserved the name. By December, Washington had fewer than 3,800 effective soldiers left. His men were starving. Their clothes were rotting off their backs. Some of them had no shoes at all, marching on frozen ground that cut their feet as they walked. And there was another problem, one that was about to become catastrophic. Most of the men's enlistments expired at midnight on December 31st. Not some of the men, most of them. The Continental Army was legally going to dissolve itself at the start of the new year. Washington crossed the Delaware on the night of December 25th. A river crossing through driving sleet and ice flows in the dark, and hit the Hessian garrison at Trenton the following morning. The victory was real, and it mattered, but it did not solve the enlistment problem. On December 31st, Washington reportedly rode his horse along the line of men who were preparing to go home and asked them, in person, to stay for 6 more weeks. He offered a $10 bounty, roughly the pay for a month and a half of service. He told them the cause needed them. Some accounts say he was barely able to speak for the weight of it. Enough men stayed, approximately 6,000 in total, including fresh Pennsylvania militia who arrived to fill the gaps. The army existed for another 6 weeks, but only just. When Cornwallis came south from Princeton on January 2nd with 8,000 troops to respond to Trenton, Washington sent Colonel Edward Hand's Pennsylvania riflemen up the road to slow the British advance. Hand's men were not trying to stop 8,000 Redcoats. They were trying to buy hours. They felled trees across the road. They set up ambush positions at every creek crossing. They fired, fell back, fired again. The British deployed their formations every time the rifles cracked from the tree line, the kind of methodical professional response that 8 times they did not have to spare. The mud ate the rest of it. New Year's Day had brought unexpectedly mild temperatures to New Jersey, and the frozen roads had thawed into deep red muck that swallowed boots and artillery wheels whole. Cornwallis's column, which should have covered the 12 miles from Princeton to Trenton in a few hours, took most of the day. His army did not reach the American lines at Assunpink Creek until late afternoon, with barely an hour of daylight left. Washington held the south bank of the creek with artillery and disciplined infantry fire. 3 times that evening, British and Hessian troops tried to force the stone bridge. 3 times the American guns drove them back. When darkness fell, Cornwallis pulled his men back to their positions. He had an army of 8,000 professional soldiers. Washington had 6,000 exhausted men with their backs to a river. The math was simple. He would finish it in the morning. That night, two things happened. Cornwallis went to sleep, and the temperature dropped. Pay attention to what happens next, because the timing of it is almost too precise to believe. On the morning of January 2nd, mild weather had turned the roads into quagmire, slowing the British advance to barely a mile an hour, buying Washington the hours he needed to survive the day. Then, on the night of January 2nd to 3rd, a hard freeze set in over New Jersey, and those same roads turned to iron. What had been an impassable bog became a highway. And with that, a plan that had been physically impossible 6 hours earlier became not just possible, but executable. Washington called a council of war that night. His officers gave him the options plainly. They could stand and fight at Assunpink Creek in the morning against twice their number with their backs to the Delaware. They could attempt to cross the river again and retreat into Pennsylvania. Or they could do something that no one in Cornwallis's headquarters was even considering: slip east around the British left flank, then turn north and march 12 miles through the dark to hit the British garrison that Cornwallis had left behind in Princeton. The frozen roads made the artillery movable. Without them, the cannon would have sunk to their axles in the mud before reaching the edge of camp. With them, Washington could take his guns with him. He also needed the British to not notice he was gone. The deception plan was simple and precise. The campfires along the creek were kept burning. Men were detailed to make noise, the sound of entrenching tools striking frozen ground, the kind of sound a fortifying army makes when it is digging in for a siege. A few men stayed behind to keep the fires stoked. Then, between 10 o'clock and midnight, the rest of the army slipped away into the dark, wheels wrapped in cloth to kill the sound. Orders passed in whispers. The baggage wagons sent south toward Burlington and out of the way. By 2 in the morning, the entire Continental Army was in motion. The march that followed was one of the most brutal physical ordeals of the entire war. The route took Washington's men east through dense woods, across an icy stream, through a stretch of swampland, over terrain that in the darkness was nothing but obstacles and cold. Many of the soldiers had no shoes. The frozen ground that made the march possible also left a trail behind them, the ground marked with the blood of their feet where they walked. Men fell asleep standing up during halts, their weight held upright by the shoulders of the men beside them. A rumor spread through the column at some point that Hessians were attacking, and a portion of the inexperienced militia broke and ran south toward Philadelphia. The column kept moving. The intelligence that made the route possible had come from Brigadier General John Cadwalader's network in the days before. Cadwalader had received a detailed handwritten map of the British positions around Princeton from a source described only as a very intelligent young gentleman who had recently returned from the area. The map showed British works, cannon positions, force dispositions, and critically, the road network, including a road that almost nobody used, a track called the Sawmill Road that ran through the farmlands south of Princeton, invisible from the main post road, leading directly into the town from a direction the British had left entirely undefended. That was the road Washington was marching his army up in the dark. Dawn on January 3rd found them at the Stony Brook crossing, about 3 miles short of Princeton. The army had marched roughly 12 miles in 5 hours, in freezing temperatures in the dark, without being detected. Washington paused to arrange his columns for the attack. The town was ahead. The British garrison numbered approximately 1,200 to 1,400 men, the 17th, 40th, and 55th regiments of foot, plus some light dragoons. Cornwallis and his 8,000 men were still 10 miles away in Trenton, probably still asleep. The fox had not been bagged. The fox was 3 miles from Princeton, and the hounds had no idea. The battle did not begin the way Washington planned. It began with a collision. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Mawhood, the British officer commanding the Princeton garrison, had received orders from Cornwallis to march 2 of his regiments south to Trenton as reinforcements. By 8 in the morning on January 3rd, Mawhood had already crossed the Stony Brook Bridge with the 17th and 55th Foot, and was moving down the post road toward Trenton. He had left the 40th Regiment to hold Princeton itself. On a rise of ground south of the brook, one of Mawhood's men looked east across the farmland and saw something moving on the Quaker Road, a column of men, partially screened by trees, marching north. Mawhood studied them. He could not determine their numbers. The wooded hills broke his line of sight. He sent a rider back to warn the 40th Regiment. Then he did something that later accounts describe with a kind of grudging respect. He reversed his column. He turned his 2 regiments around, recrossed the bridge, and went back to face whatever was coming. Washington, meanwhile, had sent Brigadier General Hugh Mercer ahead with roughly 350 Virginians and Pennsylvanians to destroy the Stony Brook Bridge, the move designed to cut off any British retreat toward Trenton and prevent Cornwallis, once he realized what was happening, from using that road to reach Princeton quickly. Mercer's men moved west toward the bridge across open farmland. They did not know that Mawhood had already crossed it. They did not know Mawhood was coming back. The 2 forces met on the farm belonging to William Clark in the open ground at the edge of an orchard. The 17th Foot reached a fence line first and took position behind it. Mercer's men came through the orchard and hit the fence line with musket fire. The exchange was brief and vicious. The 17th Foot had bayonets. Mercer's men did not. In the close-range fighting, the British drove the Virginians back with a bayonet charge that broke the formation. Mercer himself went down, his horse shot from under him. Surrounded by British soldiers who believed they had caught Washington himself, Mercer refused to surrender. He was struck with rifle butts and stabbed repeatedly with bayonets. He was carried off the field alive, but he would die 9 days later. His brigade scattered and ran. Washington had sent Cadwalader's Philadelphia militia forward to support Mercer. They arrived to find Mercer's men already in flight and the 17th Foot advancing. The militia held briefly, then they broke too. British bayonets had the advantage in close ground, and men who had never stood a bayonet charge before were not going to hold one in their first battle. For a few minutes on the Clark farm, the Battle of Princeton hung on the edge of complete collapse. Washington rode forward into it. What followed is one of the most documented moments of personal courage in Washington's military career. He rode directly into the ground between the retreating Americans and the advancing British, the open field that both sides were firing across, and he rallied the militia by the fact of his presence alone. Officers near him later recalled the terror of watching him ride to within close range of the British line, fully exposed, shouting for the men to hold. Some accounts put him within 30 yards of the British muskets. His aide, Colonel John Fitzgerald, reportedly pulled his hat over his eyes so he would not see Washington shot. Washington was not shot. He stayed in that field until the men around him steadied. Then the artillery came up. Captain Joseph Mulder's battery unlimbered on the Clark farm and opened fire with grapeshot and canister into the British formation, the kind of fire that does not wound cleanly, that tears through packed ranks and drops men in groups. The effect on the 17th Foot was immediate. The advance stalled. Washington ordered the infantry forward again, fresh Continental regiments that had not yet been committed, and the combined pressure of artillery and infantry at close range broke the British line. What had been a disciplined assault became a rout. Mawhood's men fled, some south down the post road toward Trenton, some north toward Princeton, some scattering into the surrounding countryside. Mawhood himself fought his way out with a portion of the 17th Foot, cutting through the American lines and escaping south. His discipline under fire that morning was genuine. He had been put in an impossible position by the circumstances of the night, not by any failure of nerve. In Princeton itself, roughly 200 British soldiers from the 40th Regiment had taken refuge inside Nassau Hall, the main stone building of the College of New Jersey, the institution that would eventually become Princeton University. From the windows of the building, they intended to use it as a fortress, firing positions against any American advance. The Americans positioned artillery around the building and opened fire. The garrison surrendered. 194 prisoners were taken. The famous story that Alexander Hamilton personally ordered the cannon shot that put a ball through the portrait of King George II hanging in Nassau Hall's chapel, That is a story that has been told for 250 years, and it may or may not be true. Hamilton was at Princeton that morning. He was commanding artillery. The portrait was reportedly destroyed. Whether Hamilton specifically ordered the shot or whether it is a story that attached itself to him afterward because it is too good to let go, the historical record does not settle the question cleanly. It is offered here as the famous story it is. Washington did not linger. He knew Cornwallis was coming. The Continental Army moved quickly through Princeton, looting British supply wagons for food and equipment, and then marched north towards Somerset Courthouse. By January 6th, the army was encamped in the Watchung Mountains near Morristown, in a defensive position so strong that Cornwallis, when he arrived in Princeton to find his garrison destroyed and his supply wagons stripped, made no attempt to follow. The 10 crucial days were over. The Continental Army went into winter quarters. And Cornwallis, the general who had gone to sleep on the night of January 2nd certain that the fox was caught, wrote to his superiors in London and dismissed Washington's Princeton maneuver as a desperate gamble that had gotten lucky. He predicted that if Washington attempted another campaign in the spring, the march alone would destroy his army. 6 years later, at Yorktown, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army to George Washington. By that point, he had reportedly revised his views somewhat. The casualty numbers at Princeton, on their face, look modest. British losses were officially reported as 18 killed, 58 wounded, and roughly 200 missing, with later tallies pushing the total closer to 450, representing nearly a third of the Princeton garrison. American losses were approximately 25 killed and 40 wounded, though figures vary between historians. For a battle that lasted perhaps an hour at its peak intensity, neither side suffered the kind of numbers that fill monument inscriptions. But the numbers miss the point entirely. In the 10 days between Christmas night 1776 and January 3rd, 1777, George Washington had done something that should have been impossible by the arithmetic of the situation. His army had been outnumbered. It had been outgunned. Its enlistments were expiring. It had no shoes. It had lost New York, lost New Jersey, lost months of ground in a retreat that looked, from every external vantage point, like the slow death of a revolution. And then it had won 3 engagements, Trenton, Assunpink Creek, Princeton, in 10 days, against professional British and Hessian troops, by using the cold and the dark and the mud and the freeze as weapons that no army in 1777 had a defense against. The British did not know how to fight weather. Nobody did. Frederick the Great of Prussia, one of the greatest military minds of the 18th century, reportedly called Washington's 10 crucial days the most brilliant military operations of the century. That attribution is repeated widely enough to note, and uncertain enough in its original form to flag. Treat it as attributed rather than definitively sourced. What is not in dispute is what happened to British strategy in New Jersey immediately after Princeton. General Howe, commanding overall British forces in North America, pulled his army back. He abandoned his forward posts across New Jersey, positions the British had held since the summer, and contracted his lines to New Brunswick and the coast. The vast territorial gains of 1776, the occupation of an entire colony, evaporated in the weeks after Princeton without a major engagement. New Jersey, which had seemed on the verge of becoming the first state to resubmit to British authority, reversed itself. Citizens who had sworn loyalty oaths to the Crown under occupation renounced them. The forage war that followed, months of small, brutal skirmishes between American and British foraging parties, ground down British manpower without any corresponding strategic gain. And then there is the question of what Princeton meant for what came next. The Princeton Battlefield Society puts it as plainly as it can be put. Without Princeton, there is no Saratoga. Without Saratoga, the great American victory of October 1777 that convinced France the rebellion was winnable, there is no French alliance. Without the French alliance, there is very likely no Yorktown and no independent United States. Princeton did not win the war. It kept the war alive at the moment it was closest to dying. The Continental Army that survived the winter of 1776 to 1777 was the army that fought the Philadelphia Campaign, that endured Valley Forge, that crossed to Yorktown. It survived because enough men re-enlisted on December 31st. It survived because the weather turned on the night of January 2nd. It survived because Washington was willing to march 6,000 exhausted soldiers 12 miles through frozen darkness on the basis that the alternative was certain defeat. The British lesson from Princeton was less dramatic and more corrosive. What Bunker Hill had done to Howe, the sight of his men falling in waves that scarred his willingness to take the bold risks, Princeton began to do to the entire British strategic posture in North America. The campaign of 1776 had looked like overwhelming force applied to a shrinking enemy. By January 1777, British commanders were reassessing what they thought they knew about this war. The colonists were not scattering. The army they were fighting was not dissolving. The man commanding it was capable of maneuvers in the middle of a January night that European professionals had not planned for because they had not imagined them. Cornwallis had told his officers on the night of January 2nd that the fox was caught. But the fox had left the fires burning, and the ground had frozen, and Cornwallis woke up to the sound of cannon fire coming from the direction of Princeton, 10 miles behind him, and by the time he marched his 8,000 men back up the road, Washington was already gone again, safe in the Watchung Mountains, with a victory that should have been arithmetically impossible tucked inside one of the most audacious night marches in the history of the Revolutionary War. The British took Trenton. They secured their side of Assunpink Creek. They held all the ground they had held the day before. On paper, not a great deal had changed, except that the army Cornwallis had come south to destroy was still alive. And it would fight for 6 more years. If this one kept you watching, subscribe and leave a comment. What moment from Princeton surprised you most? The night march, the weather timing, or the fact that Washington personally rode into the line of fire to stop his own army from breaking? More stories like this are on the way.